Tom Harrison's footsteps echoed through the empty concrete corridors of Metro Stadium at precisely 5:30 a.m., just as they had every morning for the past 6 years. The familiar smell of fresh paint and cleaning supplies filled the air. Maintenance crews had been hard at work overnight, preparing for today's game. After 2 decades in security and 6 years as head of security at Metro, Tom took pride in how his morning routine had become as much a part of the stadium as the steel beams holding up its massive structure. He paused at his office just long enough to hang up his weathered brown leather jacket and clip on his radio. The morning security briefing would start in exactly 25 minutes, but first he needed to complete his personal inspection of the premises. Tom had instituted this extra security sweep after the 19 incident, when an unauthorized vendor had managed to set up shop inside the stadium. Nothing serious had happened that day, but it had taught Tom a valuable lesson about complacency. The early morning light cast long shadows through the stadium's vast windows as Tom made his methodical rounds. He watched the maintenance crew finishing up their overnight work, nodding approvingly at their efficiency. The first vendors were beginning to arrive, and Tom checked each of their credentials personally, even though he recognized most of them by face. "Morning, Mr. Harrison," called Maria from her concession stand, her voice carrying the same cheerful tone it had for the past 4 years. "Coffee's almost ready." "Thanks, Maria," Tom replied with a small smile, one of the few he allowed himself during working hours. "ID badge, please?" She laughed as she held it up. It was their daily ritual, one that exemplified Tom's unwavering commitment to protocol. By 6:15, his security team began arriving for the morning briefing. Jake and Sarah, the newest recruits, were always first, eager to prove themselves. Mike, his most experienced lieutenant, arrived last as usual, but always precisely on time. Tom had handpicked each member of his 15-person day shift team, and he trusted them with his life, though that didn't stop him from running daily equipment checks on their radios, cameras, and other security gear. "Weather report shows scattered showers this afternoon," Tom announced during the briefing, standing straight-backed before his team in the security office. "That means we'll need extra attention on the concrete steps. They get slippery. And remember, wet weather means more people trying to bring umbrellas through security. Standard protocol applies, no exceptions." As he assigned positions and reviewed protocols, Tom noticed Dave, the stadium manager, hovering unusually near the security office. There was something different about Dave's demeanor today, a nervous energy that set Tom's instincts on alert. He'd caught fragments of conversations about some VIP meeting, but details had been surprisingly scarce. Outside, the first fans were already gathering, 6 hours before game time. Tom could see them from his position near the VIP entrance, where he'd stationed himself for the day. This particular entrance was his personal responsibility. A steady stream of team owners, executives, and celebrities would pass through here, each requiring careful verification despite their status. "Remember, people," Tom concluded the briefing, his voice carrying the weight of experience. "It doesn't matter if it's the hot dog vendor or the team owner, everyone follows security protocols. Last month's attempted breach at Central Stadium is exactly why we can't get comfortable. One mistake is all it takes." As his team dispersed to their positions, Tom couldn't shake the feeling that today would be different. There was an unusual buzz among the staff, hushed conversations that stopped when he approached, and an undercurrent of anticipation that didn't match a normal game day. Even Dave seemed to be avoiding his direct questions about the VIP list for the day. At his post by the VIP entrance, Tom adjusted his tie and radio one final time. The morning sun had fully risen now, casting a golden glow across the stadium's glass facade. Whatever this day might bring, Tom Harrison would face it, as he had faced every day for the past 6 years, with unwavering dedication to his duty and an absolute commitment to keeping Metro Stadium secure. The afternoon crowd had reached its peak when Tom first noticed her. Among the usual rush of VIPs hurrying through their designated entrance, team executives in their game day suits and sponsors with their shiny access badges, she stood out with an unmistakable air of quiet authority. Her charcoal gray suit was immaculately tailored, and she carried a sleek designer briefcase with the kind of easy confidence that spoke of years in corporate boardrooms. Tom watched as she approached the security checkpoint, noting her unhurried pace and composed demeanor. Unlike the typical VIPs who often arrived with an entourage or buried in their phones, she walked alone, taking in her surroundings with careful consideration. Her heels clicked purposefully against the polished floor, drawing subtle glances from the other staff members. "Good afternoon," she greeted him with a slight smile, her accent hints of both British and Asian influences. "Lovely day for a game, isn't it?" "Good afternoon, ma'am," Tom responded with his usual professional courtesy. "May I see your credentials, please?" The line behind her had grown longer, and Tom could feel the familiar pressure of impatient VIPs checking their watches. But something in her bearing made this interaction feel different from the countless others he'd handled over the years. She opened her briefcase, movements precise and unhurried. After a moment, she looked up at him with a slight furrow in her brow. "I apologize, but I seem to have a situation here. I'm expected at the executive meeting in Suite A. I'm sure if you check with—" "I'm sorry, ma'am," Tom interjected firmly but politely, "but I can't allow anyone past this point without proper credentials. It's stadium policy." He could feel the eyes of his security team watching the interaction, and he straightened his shoulders slightly. The woman tilted her head thoughtfully, seemingly more intrigued than annoyed by the obstacle. "Of course, I understand completely. Perhaps we could contact Mr. Davidson in operations? He's expecting me." Behind her, other VIPs were beginning to shift restlessly. A few were watching the scene with poorly concealed interest while others typed furiously on their phones. Tom noticed one of his junior guards, Jake, hovering nearby with an uncertain expression. "I'd be happy to have someone escort you to the general admission office where they can sort out your credentials," Tom offered, maintaining his professional demeanor, "but I cannot make any exceptions to our security protocols." She nodded, reaching for her phone with elegant efficiency. "That's quite admirable, actually. However—" She paused, her fingers hovering over the screen. "I believe there may be some confusion about my arrival. Would you mind if I made a quick call?" Tom gestured to the side of the checkpoint, maintaining order in the line while keeping her in his peripheral vision. Something about this situation felt increasingly significant, though he couldn't quite put his finger on why. The woman's composure was unusual. Most people in her position would have become frustrated by now. He noticed more staff members gathering at the edges of the area, some whispering among themselves. Even the maintenance crew had slowed their work, stealing glances at the scene unfolding at the VIP entrance. Tom's radio crackled with unusual frequency, though no one was directly addressing him. The woman spoke quietly into her phone, her expression remaining perfectly composed. Tom caught fragments of her conversation, mentions of meetings, security protocols, and what sounded like executive names he recognized. With each passing moment, the atmosphere around the checkpoint grew heavier with anticipation, as if everyone but Tom was waiting for something significant to happen. Still, he stood his ground. 6 years of experience had taught him that security breaches often came disguised in expensive suits and confident smiles. He'd rather face the consequences of delaying an authorized guest than risk compromising the stadium's security by making an exception, no matter how distinguished the person appeared to be. The situation at the VIP entrance began to take on a life of its own. What had started as a routine credential check was now drawing attention from every corner of the stadium's staff. The woman, who had yet to reveal her name, maintained her remarkable composure as she made another call, this time mentioning specific names that caused nearby staff members to exchange meaningful glances. "I've just spoken with Marcus in corporate relations," she said, her accent lending additional authority to her words. "And Sarah Johnson from the board. They're both quite confused about the situation." She smiled again, but there was something different in it now. Not frustration, but rather an almost academic interest in how events were unfolding. Tom felt the first flutter of uncertainty in his stomach, but years of experience had taught him to trust his protocols. "I understand, ma'am, but I'm afraid I still need to see proper credentials." Perhaps Mr. Marcus or Miss Johnson could bring them to you. The crowd of onlookers had grown larger, and the whispers more intense. Tom could hear fragments of radio chatter between his security team members, though oddly, none of them were addressing him directly. He noticed one of the junior executives in line frantically typing on his phone, stealing glances between the woman and Tom. Dave, the stadium manager, appeared at the periphery of the scene, his face flushed and his tie slightly askew. He kept making aborted movements toward them before stepping back, as if unsure whether to intervene. The sight of Dave's unusual behavior only heightened Tom's sense that this situation was far from ordinary. "Your dedication to security is commendable," the woman said, checking her watch with elegant precision. "Though I believe we may be able to resolve this quickly. You see, I'm actually here to..." She was interrupted by the arrival of 3 more senior staff members, all slightly out of breath and looking uncommonly anxious. They clustered nearby, speaking in hushed but urgent tones, and occasionally glancing at Tom with expressions that ranged from sympathy to disbelief. The woman observed all of this with remarkable interest, almost as if she were studying the situation rather than being inconvenienced by it. She turned back to Tom with what appeared to be genuine respect. "I don't suppose the name Chen Industries means anything to you?" Tom's heart skipped a beat. Chen Industries, the company that had recently acquired majority ownership of the stadium. He'd seen the memo just last week, though the details had been surprisingly sparse. Still, security protocols were security protocols. "I'm familiar with the company, ma'am," he replied, maintaining his professional demeanor despite the growing knot in his stomach. "But I still need to see proper credentials." The crowd's murmuring grew louder. Tom could see his own security team members exchanging significant looks, and even some of the regular VIPs in line had stopped checking their phones, now fully invested in the unfolding drama. The woman's continued patience seemed to only heighten the tension. It was as if she was perfectly content to let the situation play out to its natural conclusion. Through the growing crowd, Tom spotted more senior management figures arriving, their faces bearing expressions of increasing alarm. The woman noticed them too, but made no move to wave them over. Instead, she simply stood there, briefcase in hand, watching Tom with what almost looked like approval. The atmosphere had become electric with anticipation. Everyone present seemed to be holding their breath, waiting for something to break. Tom stood his ground, though his mind was racing through possibilities, each more consequential than the last. In his 6 years as head of security, he'd never experienced a situation quite like this, where tension and uncertainty seemed to radiate from every corner of the typically well-ordered VIP entrance. Just then, the sound of running footsteps echoed through the corridor, and Dave's voice called out with unprecedented urgency, "Tom, wait!" Dave burst through the crowd like a man possessed, his tie completely askew now and sweat beading on his forehead. He skidded to a stop between Tom and the woman, doubled over, and gasping for breath as if he'd run the entire length of the stadium. The gathered crowd fell into an immediate electric silence. "Tom," Dave wheezed, straightening up with visible effort. "Tom, this is Mrs. Chen, Eleanor Chen. She's not just from Chen Industries, she owns Chen Industries. She's our new owner, the owner of the stadium." The words hit Tom like a physical blow. The room seemed to tilt slightly as 6 years of professional pride collided with the sudden realization of what he'd been doing for the past 20 minutes. He felt the color drain from his face as his mind raced back through every interaction, every firm denial, every insisted protocol. Mrs. Chen, now finally named, stood exactly as she had been, her slight smile unchanged. But now everyone could see her in proper context. The woman who had recently acquired not just the stadium but the entire sports complex in a deal worth billions. The woman who was effectively everyone's boss. Tom started, his usual professional demeanor cracking for the first time in recent memory. The security radio at his hip seemed to weigh 1,000 pounds. "Mr. Harrison," Mrs. Chen spoke, her voice carrying easily through the hushed crowd. "Please don't apologize. In fact..." She stepped forward, and the crowd seemed to collectively hold its breath. "I believe congratulations are in order," Tom blinked, his mind struggling to process her words. Around them, Confused murmurs rippled through the gathered staff members. Dave looked as bewildered as Tom felt. I must admit, Mrs. Chen continued, her smile warming, this was something of a test, though not the one you might think. She turned to address the crowd, her presence suddenly filling the space in a way that made her earlier composure make perfect sense. When I acquire a new property, I like to understand its operations from the ground up. Security, Mr. Harrison, is always my first concern. She turned back to Tom, who stood rooted to the spot. In the past hour, I've been offered shortcuts by 3 different staff members. I've been told I could skip security protocols because of who I am. I've been advised to simply call someone to vouch for me. Her voice took on a note of approval. But you, Mr. Harrison, didn't waver. Not when I mentioned names. Not when I implied my position. Not even when it was clearly causing you professional discomfort. The crowd's energy shifted palpably as understanding dawned. This hadn't been a diplomatic embarrassment. It had been a demonstration of exactly what Mrs. Chen had wanted to see. The last stadium I acquired had a head of security who believed in exceptions, she continued, opening her briefcase to finally withdraw an ID badge. Proper, legitimate, and exactly what Tom had been asking for all along. He no longer holds that position. But you, Mr. Harrison? She smiled fully now, extending the badge to him. You've shown me exactly what I hoped to find here. Tom accepted the badge with slightly trembling hands, examining it with the same thoroughness he'd applied to thousands before it. It was, of course, perfectly in order. When he looked up, Mrs. Chen was watching him with unmistakable respect. Now then, she said, as if the last hour had been nothing more than a pleasant conversation, shall we discuss your ideas for improving our security protocols? I have a feeling they'll be worth hearing. The VIP entrance had transformed from a security checkpoint into an impromptu town hall. Mrs. Chen, rather than proceeding to her scheduled meetings, chose to remain exactly where she stood, using the moment to address the gathered staff with the natural authority of someone used to commanding boardrooms. Everyone, please gather round, she called, her voice carrying clearly through the space. The crowd, which had been beginning to disperse, reformed with remarkable speed. What we've just witnessed is exactly what I hoped to find when I acquired this stadium: integrity under pressure. Tom stood at her side, his professional composure gradually returning, though his mind was still processing the extraordinary turn of events. Mrs. Chen turned to him with genuine interest. Tell me, Mr. Harrison, about the incident in 2019 that led to your enhanced security protocols. Tom's eyes widened slightly. He hadn't mentioned that to her. She smiled at his surprise. Yes, I read all the security reports before acquiring the stadium. Rather enlightening reading, actually. Please, share it with everyone. Finding his voice, Tom straightened his shoulders. We had an unauthorized vendor breach security by taking advantage of a staff member's kindness. Nothing dangerous happened, but it showed how one small exception could create a significant vulnerability. Exactly, Mrs. Chen nodded, addressing the crowd. Security isn't about the big, obvious threats. Those are easy to spot. It's about the small compromises, the tiny exceptions that seem harmless at the time. She gestured to her badge, which Tom had finally verified. If Mr. Harrison had let me through without this, what would that have taught our staff? That rules are flexible if someone seems important enough? She turned to Dave, who was still trying to fix his tie. Mr. Davidson, please have my morning meetings rescheduled. I believe we have something more important to discuss right here. Dave hurried off, looking relieved to have a clear task to focus on. Mr. Harrison, she continued, I'd like you to walk me through your current security protocols. All of them. And then, she smiled, I want to hear your ideas for improvements. I suspect you have several that haven't been implemented due to budget constraints? Tom nodded, hardly daring to believe this turn of events. Yes, ma'am. I've been wanting to upgrade our surveillance system and implement new training programs for handling VIP situations. Excellent. Consider your budget constraints lifted. She addressed the gathered staff again. This is how we build trust, everyone. Not through shortcuts and exceptions, but through consistency and respect for our processes. She turned back to Tom. Though perhaps we can work on getting me a more permanent ID badge? The laughter that rippled through the crowd broke the last remnants of tension. Staff members began sharing glances of pride rather than anxiety. This was clearly not the typical corporate takeover they had feared. "And Tom," she added more quietly, using his first name for the first time, "I want you to lead a security review of all our properties, starting with that stadium I mentioned, the one whose head of security believed in exceptions. I have a feeling your perspective will be invaluable." As the crowd began to disperse, now buzzing with excitement rather than tension, Mrs. Chen turned to address the remaining security team members. "Your loyalty today wasn't just to your protocols or to Mr. Harrison. It was to the safety of everyone who comes through these doors. That's something I value above any corporate title." The impact of her words was immediate and visible. Security team members stood taller, their expressions shifting from lingering anxiety to genuine pride. In the space of an hour, what could have been a career-ending confrontation had transformed into a powerful demonstration of leadership, both Tom's and Mrs. Chen's. "Now then," Mrs. Chen said, checking her watch with a smile, "shall we see about implementing those improvements you mentioned? I believe we have a stadium to secure properly." The story of Tom Harrison's standoff with Mrs. Chen spread through Metro Stadium like wildfire. By the next morning, it had evolved into something of a legend, with each retelling adding new layers of detail to the security chief who had unknowingly denied entry to the stadium's owner, and been promoted for it. The changes began immediately. The morning after the incident, Tom arrived to find a state-of-the-art security command center being installed in what had previously been a storage room near his office. Mrs. Chen had apparently made several calls immediately after their impromptu meeting, and corporate efficiency had kicked into high gear. "Your new security hub," she explained during her morning visit, which was becoming a regular occurrence. "I believe you mentioned wanting better integration of our surveillance systems." She handed him a tablet displaying the specs for a security system that made their current setup look like something from the previous century. The staff's attitude towards security protocols underwent a dramatic shift. Gone were the eye rolls and subtle sighs when Tom's team insisted on checking credentials. Instead, there was a new understanding, almost a pride, in maintaining the highest standards. The story of Mrs. Chen's test had become part of the orientation for new employees, a concrete example of how doing the right thing meant exactly that. No exceptions. "Tell them about the time you stopped the owner from entering," became a frequent request from veteran staff members to Tom during training sessions. He would always downplay his role, instead using it as an opportunity to reinforce the importance of consistent security measures. Mrs. Chen proved to be more than just a one-time presence. She established weekly security meetings where Tom could present his ideas directly to her. The budget restrictions that had previously hindered his proposals vanished. New training programs were implemented, security equipment was upgraded, and additional staff were hired to ensure proper coverage during peak times. "I want Metro Stadium to set the standard," she declared during one meeting. "Other venues should look to us as the example of how security should be handled." The impact rippled beyond their stadium. Other venues in the Chen Industries portfolio began sending their security teams to Metro for training. Tom found himself conducting workshops for security chiefs from across the country, sharing his philosophy of unwavering adherence to protocols regardless of circumstances. The VIP entrance, where it had all started, underwent its own transformation. A new, streamlined system was implemented that maintained rigorous security while improving efficiency. Even the most prominent visitors commented on the professional handling of their credentials, especially after hearing the now famous story of Mrs. Chen's first visit. "You've created something remarkable here," Mrs. Chen told Tom one afternoon, about 3 months after the incident. They were reviewing the security metrics, which showed significant improvements across all categories. "But do you know what impresses me most? Not a single staff member has requested an exception to the protocols since that day. Not one." Tom's security team had grown into a tight-knit unit, proud of their reputation for excellence. The junior guards who had witnessed the confrontation with Mrs. Chen had become some of the most steadfast advocates for strict protocol adherence. They understood now that true security wasn't about making exceptions for the powerful. It was about treating everyone with the same level of professional scrutiny. As the months passed, the story became more than just an amusing anecdote. It became a symbol of the stadium's commitment to doing things the right way. When other venues faced security challenges, they often heard the same advice. You know what they do at Metro Stadium? It had become a benchmark for excellence in venue security, all because one security chief had refused to compromise his principles. The transformation was so complete that when, 6 months later, a prominent celebrity tried to bypass security by claiming a personal friendship with Mrs. Chen, the guard at the gate didn't hesitate to insist on proper credentials. Mrs. Chen, who happened to be nearby, simply smiled and asked her friend to comply with the protocols. The incident barely caused a ripple. It was just another day at Metro Stadium, where security wasn't just a procedure, it was a point of pride. 1 year after the famous encounter with Mrs. Chen, Tom Harrison stood in his upgraded security command center, reflecting on how much had changed, not just in the stadium, but in himself. The nervous, by-the-book security chief who had faced down the owner had evolved into a confident leader who understood that his rigid adherence to protocols hadn't been a limitation, but rather his greatest strength. "You've never told me," Mrs. Zach Chen said during one of their now regular security reviews, "what went through your mind that day when Dave came running up to reveal who I was." Tom smiled, something he did much more freely now. "Honestly, first sheer panic. Then confusion when you seemed pleased. But mostly I remember feeling relieved that I hadn't done anything differently just because you seemed important. And that," she nodded approvingly, "is exactly why you now oversee security for all Chen Industries venues." His new role as Director of Security Operations for Chen Industries had come as a surprise 6 months earlier. The promotion meant he now divided his time between Metro Stadium and other venues across the country, implementing what had become known as the Metro Standard, a comprehensive security approach based on unwavering consistency and respect for protocols. The security office where he'd once held tense morning briefings had been transformed into a training center, complete with simulation technology for handling various scenarios. New security officers from other venues would often stop him in the halls, eager to hear the famous story directly from its source. Tom had learned to share it with grace, always emphasizing the larger lesson about integrity and consistency. "Remember," he would tell them, "it's not about who you're saying no to. It's about what you're saying yes to, the safety of everyone who trusts us, to keep them secure." His relationship with Mrs. Chen had evolved into one of mutual respect and shared vision. They had developed a reputation in the industry for pioneering innovative security measures without compromising on fundamentals. Other stadium owners frequently consulted them about implementing similar systems, and their security protocols had become a case study in several sports management programs. The morning routine that had once been his solitary ritual had become a training opportunity. New security chiefs would shadow him as he made his rounds, learning not just the procedures but the philosophy behind them. They would watch him check every vendor's credentials, no matter how many times he'd seen them before, understanding that consistency wasn't just about rules, it was about respect for the process itself. The Metro incident, as it had become known in industry circles, was now featured in security training manuals across the country. But for Tom, its greatest impact wasn't in the professional recognition or the industry accolades. It was in the quiet confidence he developed in his own judgment. He no longer second-guessed his decisions or worried about potential fallout from enforcing protocols. He knew, with absolute certainty, that doing the right thing was always the right thing. On the anniversary of that fateful day, Mrs. Chen organized a surprise ceremony in the stadium. Security staff from all Chen Industries venues gathered to celebrate what she called the day we discovered what true security leadership looks like. Tom, standing at the podium to address his colleagues, felt a profound sense of gratitude for how a moment that could have ended his career had instead defined it. "Security isn't about keeping people out," he told the assembled crowd, meeting Mrs. Chen's approving gaze. "It's about ensuring that everyone who enters does so properly, safely, and equally." There are no exceptions to safety, no shortcuts to security, and no compromise on protecting the trust people place in us. As he looked out over the faces of his security team members, both old and new, Tom realized that his legacy wouldn't just be the protocols he'd established or the systems he'd implemented. It would be in the countless security officers who had learned from his example that principles matter more than popularity, that consistency builds trust, and that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply stand your ground. The stadium continued to evolve, and security protocols kept pace with new technologies and challenges. But at its core, Metro Stadium remained a testament to that singular moment when one security chief's unwavering dedication to his principles had transformed not just a venue, but an entire industry's approach to security. Tom Harrison's story had become more than just a legend. It had become a blueprint for excellence in venue security, proving that sometimes the biggest impact comes not from making exceptions, but from refusing to make them at all. Thanks for tuning in to today's story. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to show some love by hitting that like button. It really helps the channel grow. We'd love to hear your thoughts, so drop a comment below and let us know what you think, or share your own story ideas. If this story made you think, smile, or even gasp, why not share it with your friends and family? And don't forget to hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss an exciting update. Your support means the world to us. Thank you for being part of our storytelling journey.